You lace up your shoes and you walk out the door and you tell yourself, this is the healthiest thing you will do all day. 10,000 steps, a podcast in your ears, and a quiet sense that you are doing exactly what every doctor and every headline has told you to do. And for years that belief has been repeated so often that nobody stops to check if it is actually true. I want to be honest with you right from the start, walking is good for you, but walking is not the thing that is going to determine how long you live and how well you live while you are alive. There is something else, something most people have never had explained to them properly, and once you understand the mechanism behind it, you will never look at a gym the same way again. Before I show you what that something else actually is, if this kind of deep first principles explanation is useful to you, this channel, Smart Psychology, breaks down exactly this kind of science every week. So consider staying with me for the next few minutes, because the mechanism I am about to walk you through is going to change how you think about exercise permanently. Let's start from the ground up, the way I think any honest explanation should start. When people say walking is the best exercise, what they usually mean is that walking is safe, it is accessible, it does not require equipment, and it produces real cardiovascular benefit. All of that is true. Walking activates your parasympathetic nervous system, it improves insulin sensitivity, it increases blood flow to the brain, and multiple large studies have linked regular walking with lower rates of cardiovascular disease. I am not going to spend this video pretending walking has no value, because that would be dishonest. There is even a well-known 2018 study out of the Cleveland Clinic, published in JAMA Network Open and led by researcher Wael Jaber, that tracked over 120,000 patients and found that cardiorespiratory fitness, the kind you build through walking and other aerobic movement, had an almost linear relationship with survival, meaning fitter people simply lived longer, with no upper limit found in the data. That study genuinely surprised the researchers, and it is real, and it matters. But here's the question nobody asks after reading a headline like that. If cardiovascular fitness from walking were truly the single best predictor of a long, capable, independent life, we would expect the strongest single physical marker of human aging, the one number that shows up again and again across the largest studies on mortality, to be a cardio measurement. It is not. The strongest signal points somewhere else entirely, and that somewhere else is muscle. Let me explain what I mean by that, because muscle is one of the most misunderstood tissues in the entire human body. Most people think of muscle as something that exists for appearance, something athletes build, and everyone else can ignore. That framing is almost the opposite of the biological reality. Muscle is not decoration. Muscle is the largest organ system in your body by mass, and it functions as an active communicating tissue, not a passive block of protein sitting on your skeleton. In the last 20 years, researchers, including physiologist Bente Pedersen at the University of Copenhagen, discovered that contracting muscle releases signaling molecules called myokines directly into your bloodstream. These myokines travel to your brain, your liver, your fat tissue, and your immune system, and they change how those organs function. One of them, called irisin, has been shown in research to influence fat metabolism and even to cross into brain tissue, where it appears to support the growth of new neurons. Another, interleukin-6, released from contracting muscle, behaves completely differently from the interleukin-6 released during infection. In this context, it reduces inflammation rather than causing it. Your muscle, in other words, is not just moving your body, it is talking to the rest of your body, constantly, chemically, every time it contracts under load. There is also a myokine called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, usually shortened to BDNF, which contracting muscle helps release into circulation, and research has associated higher BDNF levels with improved memory formation and a lower rate of age-related cognitive decline. So when someone tells you that lifting weights is only about appearance, what they are actually missing is that every set of resistance exercise is functioning as a small chemical broadcast to your brain, your fat cells, and your immune system, telling all of them, at the same time, that this body is still doing demanding physical work and still needs to be maintained at a high level of function. Now here is where the Feynman-style thinking really matters, because I want you to understand the mechanism, not just memorize the conclusion. Think of your body as a building, and think of your muscle as the steel frame inside the walls. Walking is like keeping the elevators running and the plumbing working, genuinely useful, necessary even, but it does nothing to reinforce the frame. If the steel frame weakens, it does not matter how well the elevators run, the building becomes structurally unsound. That is exactly what happens to the human body as it ages, and the process has a name: sarcopenia, the progressive loss of muscle mass and strength that begins earlier than almost anyone expects. Research published in the Journal of Cachexia, Sarcopenia and Muscle shows that adults typically begin losing muscle mass in their 30s at a rate of roughly 3 to 8% per decade, and that rate accelerates sharply after age 60. By the time most people notice it, in the form of difficulty rising from a chair or carrying groceries up a flight of stairs, a significant amount of structural capacity has already been lost quietly in the background for years. And the frame analogy goes even deeper than muscle alone, because your bones are part of that same structural system, and bone tissue responds to the same kind of signal muscle does. Bone is a living tissue that remodels itself constantly, and it needs mechanical loading, real resistance, real tension to maintain its density. Walking applies a relatively gentle, repetitive load through the legs and hips, which offers some benefit, but resistance training applies a much larger, much more varied mechanical stress across the whole skeleton, which is one reason researchers studying osteoporosis increasingly point to strength training, not walking, as the more powerful tool for preserving bone density in older adults, particularly in postmenopausal women, who lose bone density at an accelerated rate once estrogen levels decline. Here is the part that I think should genuinely surprise you, because it surprised me the first time I read the research carefully. In 2015, a massive international study called the PURE study, published in The Lancet and led by researcher Daryl Leong, followed more than 140,000 adults across 17 countries. The researchers measured one simple variable, grip strength, using a handheld device that takes about 10 seconds to use, and they tracked all-cause mortality over several years. What they found was striking. Grip strength predicted death from any cause more strongly than systolic blood pressure did. Not walking speed, not step count, grip strength, a direct proxy for total body muscle quality. This single simple measurement, taken with a device that costs almost nothing, outperformed one of the most heavily monitored vital signs in modern medicine as a predictor of how long a person was going to live. That finding was not a fluke. It has been replicated across multiple large cohorts since, and it points to the same underlying truth every time. Muscle strength is not a side effect of health. It is one of the clearest windows we have into how healthy a person actually is at a cellular level. An earlier study led by researcher Taina Rantanen, published in the Journal of the American Geriatrics Society back in 1999, followed older adults over a period of years and found that midlife grip strength predicted the likelihood of disability decades later, long before any visible sign of decline had appeared. In other words, the strength you are carrying right now in your 30s, 40s, and 50s is quietly writing a prediction about your 60s, 70s, and 80s, and almost nobody is checking that number, because nobody ever told them it mattered this much. So why would strength matter more than cardiovascular fitness gained from something like walking? Here is the mechanism, and I want to build it slowly so it actually sticks with you, instead of just sounding like a fact you heard once. Muscle tissue is where your body disposes of blood sugar. When you eat carbohydrates, the majority of that glucose does not go to your brain or your liver first. It goes into your muscle, where it is stored as glycogen. If you have very little muscle mass, you have very little storage capacity, and that glucose has nowhere good to go, which contributes directly to insulin resistance, one of the central drivers of metabolic disease. Muscle is also the primary site of resting metabolic rate, meaning the more muscle you carry, the more energy your body burns, even while you are doing nothing at all. And critically, muscle mass is directly tied to something researchers call physiological reserve, the buffer of capacity your body has available when something goes wrong, an illness, a surgery, a fall, an infection. A person with strong, well-maintained muscle can absorb that kind of stress and recover. A person who has quietly lost it for 20 years without noticing often cannot, and that is frequently the actual mechanism behind what looks, on the surface, like an unrelated medical decline. There is also a hormonal layer to this that walking simply does not reach in the same way. When you place a muscle under real mechanical load, your body responds with an acute release of testosterone and growth hormone, both of which support tissue repair and long-term maintenance of lean mass. Aerobic movement like walking produces a comparatively small version of this hormonal response because the intensity per muscle fiber is so much lower. This is not an argument against walking, it is simply a description of what each type of movement is actually built to trigger inside your body. And it explains why two people can both hit 10,000 steps a day and still age in completely different ways, depending on whether one of them is also asking their muscles to work against real resistance. There is a body of research on lifelong athletes that makes this point almost impossible to argue with once you see it. Studies comparing older adults who have spent decades as dedicated distance walkers or runners against older adults who have spent decades doing consistent strength training tend to find a similar pattern. The endurance-trained group typically preserves excellent cardiovascular numbers into old age, low resting heart rate, healthy blood pressure, efficient oxygen use, but the strength-trained group is the one that more consistently preserves the ability to rise from the floor without using their hands, to climb stairs without holding a railing, and to carry a heavy bag of groceries without strain. Both groups are healthier than sedentary adults by almost any measure. That part is not in dispute. But when researchers isolate the specific outcome of functional independence in the final decades of life, the strength-trained pattern shows up as the stronger predictor again and again. That is the entire argument of this video, compressed into one comparison. Cardio protects your engine, strength protects your frame, and most of the messaging aimed at everyday people has spent decades talking almost exclusively about the engine. If you are finding this useful, this is exactly the kind of explanation smart psychology exists for, connecting the biology to the actual decision you make tomorrow morning. So if you want more of this kind of thinking broken down clearly, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making it. Now let's talk about what you actually do with this information, because understanding the mechanism only matters if it changes your behavior. I am not telling you to stop walking. Walking is genuinely good for your cardiovascular system, your mental state and your circadian rhythm, and none of that is in question. What I am telling you is that walking alone is not enough to protect the structural frame of your body as you age, and resistance training, the deliberate act of loading your muscles against resistance, is the thing that most directly determines whether you are strong, capable, and independent at 70, 80, and beyond. The research on minimum effective dose here is actually encouraging. You do not need to live in a gym. Multiple studies on resistance training frequency, including work summarized by researchers at the American College of Sports Medicine, show that meaningful strength gains and muscle protein synthesis benefits can be achieved with as little as 2 to 3 resistance training sessions per week, each lasting 30 to 45 minutes, focused on major muscle groups, legs, back, chest, and core. The specific exercise matters less than the principle behind it, progressive overload, meaning you gradually increase the weight, the repetitions, or the difficulty over time, so your muscle tissue is continually given a reason to maintain and rebuild itself. In practical terms, a genuinely effective session does not need to be complicated. It needs to cover a small number of movement patterns well, a squat or sit-to-stand pattern for your legs, a hip hinge pattern like a deadlift variation for your posterior chain, a pushing movement for your chest and shoulders, a pulling movement for your back, and some kind of loaded carry or core stabilization work to tie the whole system together. 2 sessions a week covering those patterns, done with enough resistance that the last few repetitions of each set feel genuinely difficult, is enough to produce measurable strength gains in most adults within a matter of weeks. And you do not need a barbell to do it. Resistance bands, dumbbells, or even your own body weight loaded through a slower, harder variation of a movement can produce the same mechanical tension signal your muscle is looking for. There is another piece of this that almost nobody talks about, and it connects directly back to that discovery about muscle behaving like an organ. Resistance training does something that pure cardiovascular exercise like walking does not do particularly well. It directly stimulates muscle protein synthesis, the biological process by which your body repairs and builds new muscle tissue. Research led by Dr. Douglas Padden-Jones of the University of Texas Medical Branch has shown that this synthesis process depends heavily on mechanical tension. The muscle actually needs to be loaded under resistance to trigger the strongest anabolic signal. Walking, because it involves relatively low load per stride, produces a comparatively small stimulus for this process. That does not make walking bad, it makes walking a different tool, solving a different problem. Cardiovascular exercise trains your heart and your circulatory system. Resistance training trains the actual scaffolding your body is built on. You need both, but only one of them is currently being protected by the advice you hear most often, and it is not the one you would guess. There is also a nutritional piece that makes this mechanism even more concrete. Because muscle protein synthesis does not run on mechanical tension alone, it also depends on adequate protein intake, particularly the amino acid leucine, arriving in your bloodstream around the same window as your training session. Research on protein distribution across the day, including work associated with Dr. Patton Jones, suggests that adults, especially older adults, often need more protein per meal than they are currently eating to fully trigger this synthesis process, somewhere in the range of 25 to 40 grams at a sitting. Pairing a resistance training habit with genuinely adequate protein intake is what allows the mechanical signal from training to actually translate into maintained or rebuilt tissue, rather than a workout that stimulates the process without giving your body the raw material to finish the job. Let me bring this back to something simpler, because I think the biology can start to feel abstract if I am not careful. Picture two people at age 75. One of them has walked consistently for decades and done nothing else. The other has walked and also maintained a basic resistance training habit twice a week, nothing extreme. The first person very likely has reasonably healthy blood vessels and a decent cardiovascular baseline, genuinely valuable things. But the research on falls, hospitalizations, and loss of independence in older adults points overwhelmingly toward muscle strength, particularly lower body strength and grip strength, as the variable that determines whether that person can catch themselves when they trip, rise unaided from the floor, carry their own luggage, and recover from a hospital stay without a permanent loss of mobility. The second person, with even a modest strength training habit layered on top of their walking, tends to retain that physical independence for measurably longer. This is not a hypothetical. It shows up again and again in the aging research literature. And it is the single clearest reason strength training deserves to be called something other than an optional extra. Before I finish, if this changed how you think about your own routine even slightly, that is exactly the kind of shift smart psychology is built around. So take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps more people see explanations like this instead of the surface level advice that usually circulates. So here is where all of this lands. Walking is not wrong, and it is not the villain of this story. But walking was never designed by evolution or by physiology to reinforce the structural frame of your body. And if it is the only physical activity in your life, you are protecting one system while quietly allowing another, more consequential one, to decline in the background for decades. The something else this video promised you at the start is resistance training, and specifically, resistance training treated not as a cosmetic activity for people who want to look a certain way, but as basic maintenance for the tissue that determines how independently and how capably you move through the rest of your life. 2 to 3 short sessions a week, built around real resistance, is enough to begin reversing that quiet decline, and the research shows the body responds to that signal remarkably quickly, with measurable improvements in strength markers appearing within just a few weeks of consistent training. I want to leave you with the same idea I started with, because I think it deserves to be said directly one more time. When you understand the mechanism behind a piece of advice, you stop needing to be reminded of the advice because it becomes obvious on its own. Your muscle is not decoration. It is an organ that talks to your brain, your liver, and your immune system every time you load it. Your grip strength is quietly one of the most honest measurements of how healthy you actually are. And the frame holding your entire body up, the thing that determines whether you are still independent, capable, and strong decades from now, is not built by walking alone. It is built by asking that frame to do real work, consistently for the rest of your life. Keep walking if you enjoy it. Your heart will thank you for it. But the next time you think about what your body actually needs, remember that the steel frame inside the walls is asking for something too, and it has been waiting a long time for you to notice. Feynman used to say that if you cannot explain something simply, you probably do not understand it yet. And once you strip away the marketing and the trends and the conflicting headlines, the actual explanation here is simple. Your muscle is a structural organ that needs real resistance to stay strong, and no amount of walking will substitute for that signal. Give your frame the load it is asking for. Twice a week is enough to start, and let the walking continue doing what it does well alongside it, not instead of it.